It's me, Stephanie Rudine, the Director of Donor Engagement for the ALS Association Oregon and Southwest Washington chapter. Thank you all for joining me for another session of our ALS Community Chats. Today I have with me Jeremy Van Tress, who was diagnosed with ALS in 2017. He was also a special guest speaker for us for Giving Tuesday last year, where you might have seen him talk a little bit about his background and his life. He's an amazing person who recently received his Ph.D. in social work from Walden University. Today, he's going to be presenting on his Ph.D. dissertation, ALS Patients Sociological Resilience, Self-Determination, and Decision-Making for Life-Sustaining Treatment. If you do have any questions for Jeremy, please type them into the comments and he'll answer them at the end of the presentation. I'm going to hand it over to you, Jeremy. I'm going to leave the screen so that you can share your screen and give your presentation. Thank you. Just wait until you're ready. One second, everyone. You've got it, Jeremy. Oh, there we go. Hey, Jeremy, I just wanted to pop in and let you know you're muted in case you didn't know.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jeremy Van Tress, and it is a pleasure to address you today. I was diagnosed with ALS in February of 2017. After being catapulted into early retirement, decided I needed to keep my brain sharp and wanted a more fulfilling life trajectory. Consequently, began my doctoral journey in August of 2018. Recently graduated with a Doctor of Philosophy in Social Work. I have also established a nonprofit organization, Smile Inside, where I provide clinical social work services to other people living with ALS online. Next slide. This slide shows the agenda I will follow for this presentation. Next slide. The purpose of this study was to fill the literature gap related to the health care decision-making of people with ALS, and in how people with ALS experiences with their attitudes about resilience and self-determination were related to their decision-making for life-sustaining treatments, such as tracheostomies and PICS. We sent an anonymous online survey to 11,961 people living with ALS and 197 completed it. The survey included items that asked about the participants' resilience, self-determination, their decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. The survey also included open-ended questions asking about the participants' experiences with resilience and decisions for life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. I answered 3 research questions. The first research question asked how socio-ecological resilience and self-determination contribute to people with ALS decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. The second research question asked what the relationship was between people with ALS socio-ecological resilience and their decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. The third research question asked what the relationship was between people with ALS self-determination and their decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. The theoretical frameworks that guided the variables for the study were socio-ecological resilience, perspective, and self-determination theory. Socio-ecological resilience was defined as the dynamic and evolving process of systemically exchanging individual strengths, resources, relationships, and environmental conditions to negotiate, positively adapt, and rebound from significant and overwhelming adversity. In addition to the interplay between risk and protective factors, self-determination theory is the dynamic interplay between one's extrinsic and intrinsic motivations realized by the synergistic fulfillment of basic psychological needs, including autonomy, competence, and relatedness, thereby enabling self-regulated choices. Next slide. We collected data from people with ALS who were 18 years or older and who were registered with the National ALS Registry. After excluding incomplete surveys, I ended up with 197 cases that were viable for quantitative and qualitative data analysis. Next slide. The most common demographic consisted of white males between the ages of 55 and 74, although 45% of all participants were female. It should be noted that the demographics of this study's participants were similar to other recent studies in terms of gender and ethnicity. Next slide. This slide shows the settings and conditions in which they participated. The majority of the participants were in a wheelchair and in their home while completing the survey, whereas most of the participants used a computer or smartphone. There were 13% used an assistive speech or eye gaze device and 7% needed caregiver assistance while completing the survey. Next slide. This slide shows the participants' state of functioning and disease progression at the time of the survey. These items were separated into 2 categories: symptoms and abilities. To make these items amenable for data analysis, I totaled each participant's number of negative symptoms, including wheelchair for mobility, ventilator support while sleeping, ventilator support during the day, speech device to speak, uses eye gaze, feeding to the caregiver for all ALS, to a single continuous control variable. As shown in the slide, there was a wide range of abilities and disease progression. Next slide. Nearly 23% of the participants wanted or already had a tracheostomy, and 77% did not have or did not want a tracheostomy. 60% wanted or already had plates, and 40% did not want or did not have one. As expected, participants wanted or already had plates than tracheostomies. Next slide. Whereas the overwhelming majority of the participants had a basic knowledge and awareness about advance directives, only 64% of them had completed advance directives. Some of the participants were still early in their diagnosis and either did not have sufficient time to think about their preferences for life-sustaining treatments, or had an emotional aversion to making the decision. Next slide. This table shows the 7 themes I found from the open-ended questions and how many times the participants made comments about each theme. The first theme was that individual communal health care. Philosophical and relational resources are critical to supporting people with ALS decision making. Second theme was that many people with ALS decisions for life-sustaining treatments are not merely yes or no decisions at single points in time. Instead, these decisions are grown-up processes influenced by tensions related to their perceived burden, function, and quality of life. Disease progression at the time of making the decision and after the procedure. Third thing was that people with ALS who can adapt to their situations and environments seem to be more willing to consider getting life-sustaining treatments. Fourth thing was that people with ALS who are less able to adapt to their situations and environments seem to be less willing to consider getting life-sustaining treatments. Fifth thing was that relationships and connections are critical for people with ALS resilience, self-determination, the ability to die with dignity. Sixth theme was that the COVID-19 pandemic, the availability of a treatment/cure, religious beliefs are environmental and supernatural forces that impact people with ALS resilience and decisions. Last theme was that to gain a sense of control over their disease and circumstances, some people with ALS act resiliently and exercise their self-determination by choosing to die when and how they wish without life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. For the second and third research questions, there was no significant relationships between the participants' socio-ecological resilience and self-determination in their decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. However, participants' age, gender, military veteran status, disease progression were significant predictors for choosing whether or not to get tracheostomies and PEGs. Next slide. The next two slides show the tables with the statistical results for the relationships. They are very busy, but I will interpret them in an easy way to understand. This table shows the relationship between the participant's resilience and the other variables, including age, gender, military veteran status, and the negative symptoms associated with disease progression. For every 1 year increase in age, the participants were less likely to choose to get a tracheostomy. Being female increased the odds of choosing to get feeding tubes. Military veterans were also more likely to choose to get a tracheostomy and a feeding tube. The participants who were not military veterans were less likely to get tracheostomies and feeding tubes. The participants with more negative symptoms were more likely to choose to get feeding tubes. Next slide. This slide shows the table with the statistical results for the relationships between the participants' self-determination and the other variables, including age, gender, military veteran status, and the negative symptoms associated with disease progression. For every 1 year increase in age, participants were less likely to choose to get a tracheostomy. Being female increased the odds of choosing to get feeding tubes. As with the resilience variable, military veterans were more likely to choose to get a tracheostomy and a feeding tube. The participants who were not military veterans were less likely to get tracheostomies and feeding tubes. The participants with more negative symptoms were more likely to choose to get feeding tubes. Overall, these results showed that people's age, gender, military veteran status, the number of negative symptoms associated with people's disease progress impact people with ALS decisions for life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. Slide shows a figure of what I termed the ecological decision-making model, which I propose ALS multidisciplinary social workers follow as they help their patients navigate the decision-making process. Model is comprised of the 5 decision-making tensions, 5 socio-ecological systemic interactions, the 5-phase process to empower people with ALS decision-making, 5 primary decision-making tensions shown in the center of the figure's Venn diagram are tightly woven with each other and represent the conditions that prevented or motivated the participants to get pegs and tracheostomies. 5 tensions contribute to the participants having unique thresholds of conditions and circumstances that they would or would not be willing to accept when deciding about life-sustaining treatments. The 5 recursive phases are shown in the outer layer of the ecological decision-making model. These phases include establishing a relationship between the provider, patient, the family or caregivers, sharing accurate facts and information about life-sustaining treatments in a neutral manner for people with ALS to consider. Period time when the patient and family make an initial decision about whether or not to get a peg and tracheostomy, implementing the decision. Following up to determine if the decision has changed. While these phases are often done in order, in many instances, phases can be revisited at any time. Finally, the ecological systemic interactions, shown in the middle layer of the model, play a critical role in executing this ecological decision-making model. The ecological systemic interactions occur at various levels of each person's position in society, including the micro, meso, macro, and chronosystems. The microsystem is made up of the people, organizations, and relationships that interact directly with the individual, such as family, friends, church, school, the workplace, the person's neighborhood. The meso-system includes the interactions within the microsystem that indirectly affect the individual. For example, when a family interacts with the person's friends, school, church, or health provider, the systemic features of socio-ecological resilience relate to the connected yet distal interactions that enhance the micro and mesosystemic interactions and subsequently impact someone's well-being. Macro-systemic interactions are the attitudes and ideologies of the culture that influence the individual and other systems. Finally, the chronosystem is composed of the events and transitions that affect the individual and other systems across time and the life course. The chronosystem also involves the timeline of historical events that have occurred across someone's life. ALS multidisciplinary social workers must consider these systemic interactions as they help people with ALS navigate the primary tensions in their decision making. They must also consider these systemic interactions when applying the ecological decision-making phases to ensure their patients' strengths and resources are utilized and that all of the potential obstacles are addressed holistically. Next slide. Was a significant predictor across all 4 of the models, which showed that for every increased year in age, participants were less likely to choose to get a tracheostomy and peg. Although the sample in the study consisted of over 10% more men than women, the frequency distributions for tracheostomies and pegs by gender were mixed. 29 men and 16 women indicated that they wanted to get or already had a tracheostomy. Conversely, 63 women and 55 men indicated that they wanted to get or already had a peg. The participants' military veteran status was also a significant predictor across all of the models and showed that being a military veteran increased the odds of choosing to get tracheostomies and pegs. This finding might be due to veterans having access to financial and health care resources that non-veterans do not, which is consistent with our and colleagues' assertion that having access to and utilizing resources can facilitate adaptive coping and resilience. Disease progression variable was a significant predictor for PACE. This finding is consistent with the second theme of the qualitative results, which found that the participants' disease progression was a factor in people with ALS decision making. Generally, the more people progress in the disease, less likely they are to get life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. We found a strong, significant relationship between the independent variable sociological resilience and self-determination. This finding is consistent with previous studies done in 2017 and 2018 by Perlman and colleagues. However, both studies used the Cover-Davidson resilience scale instead of the adult resilience measure revised used in this study. This relationship is evidence that satisfying people's basic psychological needs could increase people's resilience, as shown in the studies done by Perlman and colleagues. Next slide. We found a strong, significant relationship between the independent variable sociological resilience and self-determination. This relationship is evidence that satisfying people's basic psychological needs could increase people's resilience, as shown in the studies done by Perlman and colleagues. Next slide. This slide shows a table displaying the open-ended data and statistical data that intersected, along with their respective mixed conclusions. We made 5 conclusions from this table. The first was that older people with ALS who have had more life experiences were less likely to get tracheostomies. The second was that military veterans with ALS have resources that non-veteran people with ALS do not, making them more likely to choose to get life-sustaining treatments. Third was that the state of disease progression contributes to whether or not people with ALS choose to get or maintain life-sustaining treatments. Fourth and fifth were that life-sustaining treatments are not merely yes or no decisions, and that some people with ALS who answer no also have specific conditions under which they might be willing to get a tracheostomy. Next slide. Although this study produced significant and meaningful findings, there were some limitations. The overall response rate was only 1.2%. Which might have limited the generalizability of the findings of the overall ALS population. Only 4 of the participants were tracheostomized, which limited the generalizability for people with ALS with tracheostomies. Minorities were undersampled, which limited the generalizability of the findings of minority people with ALS. This also could have been a symptom of selection bias, given the rate of high scores on the adult resilience measure revised. Also, because I did not oversample military veterans, the findings should be interpreted with caution and follow-up studies should be done. The overall sample size was limited, which could have impacted the statistical significance of the regression tests. By implementing a structured qualitative protocol, I could not ask follow-up questions for clarification. Finally, findings were limited to people with ALS responses at a single point in time. Next slide. The study provided a scientific rationale to increase socioeconomic and healthcare resources for people with ALS who are not military veterans. These resources could be in the form of caregiver reimbursements to reduce burden and enable people with ALS to get life-sustaining treatments without being thrust into poverty. This study also yielded the ecological decision-making model, which is a process by which ALS social workers and other providers can use to engage people with ALS throughout the decision-making process holistically and systematically. This study also brought to light the power and influence that ALS providers have on people with ALS decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. Providers must recognize and be mindful of the power differential that exists between them and their patients. Finally, because this study showed a relationship between people with ALS basic psychological needs and their resilience, social workers should consider doing motivational interviewing interventions with people with ALS to increase resilience and become sure about their decisions for life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. This study was a community effort between the participants and Walden University. The study addressed the research gap surrounding the relationship between people with ALS sociological resilience, self-determination, decision-making for life-sustaining treatments. This next methods study yielded data findings that captured people with ALS experiences and perceptions of the phenomenon. While there were no statistically significant relationship between the primary variables, there were significant relationships with covariates, such as age, gender, military veteran status, disease progression. Findings give empirical rationales for positive social change for ALS social workers to use an ecological decision-making model, which could reduce the burden and enhance the quality of life of people with ALS. Additionally, the ecological decision-making model could improve interactions between people with ALS and their ALS providers and empower people with ALS decisions for life-sustaining treatments. Next slide. Must express my gratitude to Walden University and my dissertation committee for their dedication and mentorship, which were critical to completing this study successfully. I would like to thank the ALS Association for giving me this opportunity to present my dissertation's findings. Special thanks to the National ALS Registry of the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. Agreement for this study was part made possible by their national research notification mechanism. Finally, express deep appreciation for the people with ALS who participated in this study. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Please feel free to email me with any questions or thoughts. You can also download the entire dissertation for free.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you so much and giving your presentation today. We just had a few questions. I think you ended up answering this later on in the presentation. One was, why do you think veterans are more likely to get a trach event? And it seemed like that you referenced studies and previous studies about the fact that veterans have more significant resources than non-veterans as part of that. Is that correct?
Yes, while I can't be certain yet, that is my hypothesis. Resources that veterans have seemed to support their decisions for life-sustaining treatments more.
Okay, thank you. I had a question myself, Jeremy. You mentioned how social workers can apply this when working with people living with ALS. And one of your, I think it was in one of your suggestions was through motivational interview interventions. Can you give an example or a description of what that is for someone like myself who isn't, who just hasn't heard of that before?
So motivational interviewing is an intervention where the clinician helps the person explore the obstacles and confusion around being confused about making decisions. The overall intent with that intervention is to help the person come to an understanding about what they want and to feel comfortable with the decision. It's used in many disciplines, including counseling and social work.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate that. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining today. And I think, I actually learned quite a bit from it, and it relates to some initiatives that we have going on, I think, at the ALS Association, of course, as well. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Jeremy? I can put in the comments a post to the link to your full dissertation as well. And yeah, thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Stephanie. It was wonderful to be with you today, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share this with our community.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, well, I will be back next month, probably with a new guest. But yeah, please check out Jeremy's full dissertation for any additional information on this really important topic. Thanks, Jeremy.